Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. So I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including IBM, Qlik, Databricks, SAP, and Crowdflower, to name just a few. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Now, today's webinar is entitled Building a Compelling Argument with Data, and that'll be presented by Tableau. But before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. Now, I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation, because we'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Robert Kosara with Tableau. Robert is a research scientist at Tableau Software. His focus is on the communication of data through visualization and visual storytelling. Robert's also working on furthering our understanding of visual perception and cognition so we can make data easier to understand and develop tools to communicate it more effectively. Before joining Tableau in 2012, Robert was Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He received his master's and PhD degrees in computer science from the Vienna University of Technology in Austria. And in his spare time, Robert likes to run long distances and write articles for his website, eagereyes.org. Well, Robert, thanks for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation. Now, telling stories with data sounds like a great idea, but often you simply want to make clear and compelling arguments. So how do you do that? Well, in today's Data Science Central webinar, Robert will walk us through a particular structure for stories that works well in news graphics and describe how and why it applies to data. He'll also talk about the difference between classical story and a story with data based on his research and experiences. So Robert, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for joining this webinar this morning or afternoon. In data visualization, we often talk about how we should present, or actually we don't usually talk about how we should present data. We usually talk about the analysis of data. We talk about how to represent data, how to show data in bar charts and line charts and whatever kinds of types of charts you think are the right fit. And we build dashboards and all kinds of ways of looking at usually fairly large amounts of data. But there's also different kind of visualization, and that is the presentation of data or the communication of data. And that's what I want to talk about today. And in the last 5 years or so, a little over 5 years, I guess, there's this term that has become kind of a common industry word, that is the term storytelling. And for this kind of work, for this kind of presentation of data. And I find that equally helpful and distracting, because it's useful to think in terms of story and in terms of what storytelling can teach us, but it also can lead us astray a little bit. So I want to talk more really about data presentation than storytelling as such, and I will talk about the differences a little bit as I'm walking you through today's talk. Now, when we talk about data presentation, there is one person that I need to immediately talk about, and that is Hans Rosling.
Here we go. Can you see there? It's China. They're moving against better health. They're improving there. All the green Latin American countries, they are moving towards smaller families. The yellow ones here are the Arabic countries, and they get larger families, but longer lives, but not larger families. The Africans are the green down here. They still remain here. This is India. Indonesia is moving on pretty fast. And in the 80s here, you have Bangladesh still among the African countries there. But now Bangladesh, it's a miracle that happens in the 80s. The imams start to promote family planning, and they move up into that corner. And in 90s, we have the terrible HIV epidemic that takes down the life expectancy of the African countries, and all the rest of the world moves up into the corner where we have long lives and small family, and we have a completely new world.
Now, some of you may have seen this video before. This is from Hans Rosling's TED Talk that he gave in 2006. So this is quite a while ago. And I remember when this landed, when this became a thing that people were sending around, that was just like shocking. Like somebody had figured out how to present data. And this kind of data in particular, this is public health data. And public health data is the most boring data you can imagine. It's just really not interesting. It's tables of numbers and mortality rates and this and that. But Rosling had figured out how to show that data in a way that was compelling, that people would actually want to see. When you Google his name, so that's Rosling, R-O-S-L-I-N-G, and in his TED Talk, you will see that it's been watched like millions of times. And this is a professor of public health talking about the state of the world. I mean, that's really what it is about. So this is really the first time anybody had done this in a way that was nearly as compelling. And Rosling also, he gave a talk at the Tableau conference in 2014, and I remember seeing that, and seeing him on stage was even more impressive because he was just really able to turn this relatively straightforward format of just having slides into something much more compelling. Like he had this huge pointer that you can see there, this stick with a pointer at the end, and he would be like running around, pointing at things and pointing things out, and talking about the data and really making it compelling and interesting and getting his enthusiasm about the data across to the audience and really making them understand why he cared and why they should care and why this data was important. He ended up building this bar chart out of toilet paper rolls to illustrate a point. I forget what the point actually was, but I think it had to do with sanitation. But it was really just fascinating to watch this whole variety of ideas that he had about how to turn numbers into a performance, into something that was compelling as a presentation. And that was very far removed from what would be like the best practices for data visualization. Nobody's going to tell you that the best way to represent data would be toilet paper rolls, or to use some of the techniques he's using in the earlier example, that animated scatter plot. People have been looking into that, and they found for analysis it's not that useful. But for presentation, it's really interesting. So the way we need to think about presentation and visualization as part of presentation is quite different from the way it works in analysis. And that is what I want to talk about today. I've talked about the kind of techniques that people use in the past. If you look through the Data Science Central Web archive, you will find some of those talks there. But today I want to talk about the structure of a presentation and the structure of an argument that you can make using data and as part of a presentation. And so many of the examples I'm going to show you are from data journalism, from news graphics, and there is this idea of what's called the inverted pyramid. And I like to draw my pyramids right side up, but the idea is that you start big at the tip of this pyramid, or at the well, at one end anyway, with a headline, and the idea is that the headline gives you all the information that you need for that presentation, for that article. So it says in one short sentence or a fragment of a sentence, it tells you what the main point is that you're going to see. And then there's what's called the lead, or the first paragraph. That's going to tell you more about the story, but and the idea is that you read the headline and the lead, and you know as much basically as possible about what the story is about just from that. And then you can continue. There's more. There are facts and facts and facts, and those continue for a while. But the further down you get in the story, the less interesting the facts usually are. And again, the idea being that you could read just the beginning and then stop reading at some point. There's also this story about how supposedly it's for typesetting, so the typesetter, layouter could just take the story and cut it from the end without losing the important bits. But this is a structure that's quite common in news writing, especially for breaking news, not so much in features. And that has also been adopted a little bit for the kind of the telling of stories with data, especially, again, in news graphics and in journalism. Now, the problem with this is that it's really not much of a structure. It's a structure, it is a structure of sorts, but it is a structure that only tells you how to structure the beginning and how to shape the beginning, but it doesn't tell you how to end the story. And that's usually where you really feel kind of like you're just drifting off because the data just kind of keeps coming, but it's not really tied in anymore into the main story. So what I want to talk about today are structures that are different from that and that have more of a tie-in at the end and that give you more of a complete picture than this kind of structure. And I'm going to start with an example here that is called Understanding Hidden Hunger. This is a piece that is on Tableau Public. This was built by a number of people in collaboration over about a year or so. This was started by Derek Schwabe, who works for Bread for the World Institute, and Lee Fonseca, who is a branding consultant. They met at a conference that we run that's called Tapestry. It's the data storing conference that we run. And I want to walk you through this briefly. This is a bit of like explaining a joke here, but I will just walk you through the steps just to show you what this story is. And then I want to talk about its structure. So the story starts here by showing you the title, Unmasking Hidden Hunger. And it starts by talking about how the world has changed over the last almost 30 years. So since 1990, things have gotten better. Hunger has decreased, and they have some data for that. They show here some statistics about stunting, which is when a child is too small for his or her age, and that's a measurable way of looking at nutrients, and that's how much food people are getting. And they can show that it has decreased. Things are getting better because stunting is decreasing. They're also showing in this next dashboard here that is a bit too detailed, and I don't look too much at the details here. This is really more about to just give you a kind of brief, high-level walkthrough. But this chart here shows that stunting has decreased the most in the low and middle-income countries. So those countries that needed improvement the most actually had the most improvement. So that's a good thing. Now, however, and this is where the plot twists a little bit. Despite this progress, there is a different kind of hunger today, and they call this the hidden hunger, and that is micronutrient deficiencies. Now, these deficiencies look different, and in the sense that it's not obvious that the people who have them are hungry, because what they lead to are two things that they call the double burden here, and that is obesity, weirdly enough, and diabetes. So this is a chart here showing diabetes and obesity rates in a number of countries. And they talk about how this has become a growing problem, in particular because many of these countries that have these issues now just haven't had them in the past. So in the West, we would call these lifestyle diseases. This is not a good term to use when you talk to people who are doing development work because they get really upset with you. But it's a bit like that. So these are caused by the Western lifestyle invading these countries and people eating different kinds of foods that they just didn't in the past. And so back to the data here, they show that this has been increased. Obesity rates have been increasing a lot, especially in countries like Fiji and Guyana and the Philippines and a few others that really had very, very low obesity rates in the past. And the problem with that is not just that they now are suffering from these diseases, but that they're just not prepared for that. So what this chart here shows is that a number of these, including the Philippines here and Fiji and a few others, in these columns are different kinds of tests and treatments, including insulin, that just are not available in many of these countries. So these the red dots showing things that are not available. And so it means that these countries that just haven't had to deal with these issues in the past just don't have the infrastructure, don't have the means to treat their populations and to help them deal with problems like obesity and diabetes. And so the end here essentially on this slide that talk about that summarizes that. They talk about how a large number of people, hundreds of millions of people, suffer from hunger still, but it's a different kind of hunger. It's just the fact that they're not getting they are getting a sufficient amount of calories, and actually they're getting too many calories, but they're not getting macronutrients like I guess iron and a number of other things that they would need, that their bodies would need, and so they keep eating. And that's then how they turn obese and diabetic. And the last slide here is, or last step in this story is essentially a call for action to say, help us spread the word and help us fight this kind of hunger. Again, this is on Tableau Public. If you go to public.tableau.com, or if you just search for unmasking hidden hunger, you will find it, and you can step through yourself. There's a lot of data in this. But the structure of it is fairly straightforward. That's what I want to talk about most here. I want to talk about the way they tell the story rather than the individual views. So the structure here is that they start by saying, we've made a lot of progress. Hunger is down, stunting is down. We can actually show that things have improved over the last 27 or so years. However, there is now this double burden of deficiencies and obesity, and actually of diabetes and obesity, that is becoming a much larger a large problem in itself, and potentially a larger problem than before, with diabetes on the rise and a developing world, a lot of developing countries that just are not prepared for this, and that just aren't able to deal with this kind of issue. And the final step then is to say we need to rethink what hunger means and what it is and how it needs to be treated. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because the structure here, I think, works really well as a way to show you data and to make it interesting. So this is much more of a story in a way, where the structure isn't just to say, here is the first thing you need to know. You don't start by saying diabetes and obesity are on the rise in the developing world. They keep that for later. They only do that kind of towards the end, until after they have shown you that things have actually improved. So they kind of give you the sense that things are getting better, and they are. But then they change the narrative. They kind of frustrate your expectation that things will just keep getting better here, and tell you that things are actually also getting worse at the same time. I think that's a really powerful way of structuring the story. And so here are a few of the things that I think are pretty useful to learn from this particular story, from this particular example. The first one is to balance the detail and the big picture. I think that what they do here with these slides in between the data with the photographs and the text is a very smart idea, because even if you don't really understand how to read all these charts, or if you don't care for the numbers, you can still read that and get the big picture quite easily. And if you don't believe it, then you can still look at the numbers. But it's giving you both. The second is to add human interest. So showing that this is actually impacting real people. It's not just numbers. It's not just an obesity rate here, and it's a micronutrient number here, and a diabetes, whatever percentage, but it adds to the presentation that you can actually see the people. You can actually get a feeling for who is affected here. A common way of doing things that is also a good tip for presentation and for writing and many other things is to go from the known to the unknown. So you start with the things that are known. You start by talking about hunger and the kind of hunger people are used to, that they understand. And then you talk about how that has gotten better. And then you go to the unknown. You go to this new kind of hunger. You talk about how that is different and what that means and how that is affecting people. And that way you lead people into the story much more easily and much more effectively than if you just throw the new thing at them without enough context. And then finally, what they do really well here, and that's why I picked this example, is you have to look for the plot twist. So many presentations I see are just really linear, where you just start by talking about one thing and you keep talking more about it and more about it. But if you have a way to say, there's one thing, but then there's another thing, you can, that but makes for the plot twist, that makes it more interesting and more compelling, and also makes it more memorable, because people will remember that are more likely to remember it than if you just keep saying and this and that, because then you just have this linear progression through facts and through data that isn't nearly as interesting to listen to and to pay attention to. And so these same ideas, or some of those same ideas, I want to apply to some more data-driven things here that are more directly data-driven and a bit more focused on the data. And I want to talk about what I call argument structure. I had a paper on argument structure at the Eurovis conference earlier this year, and this is what the second part will be about. And the structure, again, is different from the inverted pyramid, and the reason for that is that it's useful to think in terms of what does the inverted pyramid not give you, or what do you want to get that you just don't get from that. One of those is that you want to raise expectations. You want people to have a certain idea of what they're looking for, and then you can look at whether you want to keep going with that, or whether you want to create some tension by saying, well, but is it? Or by changing the direction, by having this plot twist towards the end. And the tension is useful for a number of reasons. Tension creates curiosity. You get that from lots of classic stories that they give you this kind of beginning where something interesting happens that has a lot of kind of open possibilities. Like Little Red Riding Hood walks into the dark, huge, scary forest. And so many things can happen in there. It's an open space of possibilities. So what's going to happen? You want to know. You get curious about that, and that gets your attention, and which is my next point here. So you get people's attention through that, and when you tickle their attention and their curiosity, people remember what you told them, and it's much more interesting to listen to things, and then you will remember those more. Are you more likely to remember them if there was that was more compelling than a linear structure? And I wanted to show you a few examples of that. Our first one here is a piece from the New York Times in 2012, actually. I think that this has been a few years, by Hannah Fairfield, and it's called The TenYear Pipeline at Harvard Business School. And what's a bit hard to read here is that she makes a claim here at the beginning. She says that Harvard Business School says that they want to hire more women this year, they want to improve their gender balance, but they're not doing this right now. That's essentially what this says. And what you see here in this graphical part of it, the little bubbles here, these little dots, are the faculty at Harvard Business School, and the blue dots here are the men, and you can see that there are a lot more men than women. So how is this going to change? And is that claim right that they're going to have to really ramp up the hiring if they want to do this? So they looked at, or Hannah looked at data here. She looked at the tenured professors. These are professors, these are tenured male professors, and how long they've been at Harvard Business School, and put them on this timeline, and you can see that there are people here who have been there for a while. I think the longest one is 51 years that he's been at the school. But this is the distribution of the tenured faculty, the male tenured faculty. And then she compares those to the female tenured faculty in the orange dots again, and there are a lot fewer, as we already saw, and you can see that distribution there. Another question is, well, what about people coming into the school, people who are starting there, who have been there for a little bit but not that long? And this is now adding the untenured faculty. These are the assistant professors at HBS. And you can see the male tenured professors, and you can see that there's a good number of them coming in, and some fraction of them will get tenure and will then become these filled dots. What about the women? Well, if you look at that, it doesn't look that great. So we see that there are a lot fewer orange empty circles here that hopefully will turn into filled circles at some point than the blue ones. So clearly the future doesn't look terribly bright here for change, because just the number isn't there coming in. So what's interesting about this is that, first of all, it's of course based on numbers. This is part of a larger story, but it's accompanying the story itself with data. And the structure here is that there is an initial claim. The claim is that Harvard Business School will have to really ramp up its hiring if they want to improve the gender balance, because they're not doing this right now. And then what happens, what Hannah shows here, what Hannah Fairfield shows, is that she shows a number of facts. So the tenured men first, then the tenured women, and the untenured men. And then the final one is what I call a combined fact and conclusion, which is the untenured women. So at this point, it just shows that last step, which is how many women there are coming in, how many female assistant professors there are coming into the school. And at that point, it's clear, you just see the comparison right away, that that claim makes a lot of sense, because clearly having raised this issue that there aren't enough female professors, it doesn't look like it's going to change. She doesn't have to, like I've been talking about this a lot too much, actually. You can see it much more easily in the actual charts. That ties that conclusion back to the claim and ties the facts back to the claim. And that is different from the structure I talked about earlier, which is the inverted pyramid structure, where you start with the conclusion. You would say they're not going to do it, and then you just show the numbers, but you don't never tie that back to the beginning. But this, I think, was really effective in this particular example, this particular case. Now, I want to take a little detour here into the world of academia and show you a bit of work that I found quite useful in thinking about structure. And that work is coming from the world of comics studies. So comics are a useful way of looking at the presentation of data because of the way they sequence steps. So I'm going to show you a very simple comic here, and I'll give you a second to read that. This is a very simple 4-pane comic. And this guy, Neil Cohn, whose work this is, has classified the steps, the frame in this comic, into 4 different types. He starts by calling the first one an establisher. The establisher tells you where you are, where this whole thing takes place. And then there's the initial. The initial is when the action starts. So in this case, she starts slapping the guy, or she starts moving her hand. And then there's the peak action, where she actually does it. And then there's what's called the release. And the release is in these comics that are supposed to be funny. This is actually where it gets funny, because you get kind of the response to the action, in this case, the non-response. And that's a structure that Cohn has found in lots of these short comics. There are a few more types of frames, but this is useful as a structure at the beginning to just look at that. And so he has this, he uses these letters, these initials, to classify, or to have a shortcut for this. And so the establisher is E, the initial is I, the peak is P, and the release is R. So he has this structure he calls EIPR that he has found in lots of different places. And this was applied, so this is useful because in looking at stories, or in looking at news graphics that have steps, we have these steps that you walk through, and you can think about how you establish what you talk about, like the Harvard Business School example. You then start by kind of making the first steps and so on. And this structure has been found by others, Amini et al. This is a paper from 2016. They looked at not news graphics so much, but data videos. And they found that this EIP or EIPR structure is actually quite common in these videos. So what you see, what I circled here at the bottom, is those kinds of videos that follow the structure where you have an establisher, an initial, and then a peak. And the plus there means repetition. So you might have several establishing steps or several initial steps and so on. And you can see that most of these videos actually follow that, or at least some part of that. So I thought about what would we use, or how could we use this for data story or data presentation? And I came up with a somewhat different but related kind of classification, because I also tried to apply this EIPR pattern, and it kind of works, but there are differences that I think are important and useful to know. And I call this the CFO pattern, which I realize is a bit problematic when you're thinking about financial stuff, but I will just stick with this because it's easy to remember. So, and I wanted to take letters here that didn't overlap with cones or presentations so that I could compare them more easily. So we can start with a claim, which I call, or a question, which I use the C for, and then there are facts or evidence, that's F, and then there is a conclusion, I use O for that, and then there could be a combined fact and conclusion, which you just saw earlier, and there's also explanation slides, or steps that I'm not going to talk about today. And the structure that I'm proposing here, and we will see in a moment, is that you start with a claim, then there are multiple facts, it's the plus sign there, and then the conclusion at the end. So when we look back at this example I showed you a little bit ago about Harvard Business School, you can see those same elements. So it starts by making a claim. This is that first step here. That's the C in my classification. And then there are facts. We start with the tenured men here as the first fact, then the tenured women, the untenured men, and then the untenured women at the end. And this is the last one is because it also kind of ties back at the same time. I call this a fact and conclusion step. And so you can see that there's this pattern here that we have a claim, facts, and then the conclusion, or fact plus conclusion at the end as well. Another example here is a piece from Bloomberg that is, I think this was first done in 2015, but they've been updating it over time. And this is called What's Really Warming the World. And it talks about climate change. And what it shows you is different. And so maybe I should start by saying, so there's a question here. I'd ask a question, what's really warming the world? Perhaps you don't know. So here is an attempt at explaining it. And what it's showing here in this line chart is the observed temperature anomaly. So this is the temperatures, the global temperatures relative to a baseline that was picked here at some point during the last century, I think. And so this is the observed data. And then they say, well, what are possible explanations for that? And they walk through a number of possibilities. So they say, well, is it the Earth's orbit? And so in every step here, they're going to keep that gray line the same, which is the baseline, essentially. That's what we're comparing to. And then the possible explanation is going to be a new line, and you see this that would explain some part of it, and it would and it also has not just a line there, but also this area of uncertainty. So they have this kind of variability in there as well. Say that there is certain uncertainty within that data, of course. So we'll start with the Earth's orbit and see if that's it. And it turns out it doesn't seem to be it. Maybe it's the sun. Well, it doesn't look like it's that, because that's also quite different. Maybe it's volcanoes. Well, that also doesn't look like it's a great explanation. And then maybe all of these natural causes, if we combine them, we can look at those together and we see, well, that doesn't seem to be a good explanation either. Well, maybe it's not nature, but maybe it's man-made, but it is deforestation. Well, looking at that data, doesn't look that likely. Is it ozone pollution? Again, not terribly likely. Or aerosols, and it turns out aerosols actually have the opposite effect. So that's not it. And then you can see that, well, actually, if you just take greenhouse gases, you can see that they're a pretty good fit for what's been observed. You can see that the impact that they have is quite clearly following that same line. And then when you combine all the factors, so this is taking the natural and the man-made factors all together, they actually really very, very closely follow the observed effect. Now, this one is a good example, and I keep talking too much about it. It's a bit more compelling when you look at it yourself and click through it. But the structure of this story is nice because it has a bit of a nesting to it. So it starts by making a claim. Actually, it asks a question. I just call this the claim, but in this case, it's the question. It says, what's really warming the world? And then it shows you a number of facts. So these are the natural causes. It starts with the Earth's orbit and then talks about the sun and then volcanoes. And then it combines those three and says, well, taking those together, we can see that they're clearly not hitting they're not answering the question, but this ties it together back to the claim of the question. And then they show more facts. They show the man-made causes, land use and ozone and aerosols and greenhouse gases as individual facts, and then tie those together and say, well, those taken together could also be it, but not it. And then taking all those factors together actually answers the question because it really nicely follows that pattern of the observed increase in temperatures. And so what happens here, and if you're familiar with regular expressions, you might recognize this, but I will walk through this very quickly here because it's a very simple structure. What happens here is that there is a repetition here of the facts plus conclusion elements. So the idea is that the plus here again means repetition. So we inside those brackets, then the brackets just basically group things together. The parentheses, the parentheses group things together. So we have facts, F plus O here means facts repeated, and then a conclusion. We take those as a group, and we see that twice here. So we repeat that whole thing. That's what the second plus means. And we start out with a claim or a question, that's the C at the beginning, and we have an overall conclusion at the end. So this structure, the structure that has the claim, then facts plus a conclusion, still works really well, and actually even works better when it's when it's nested, because then now you have a bit more of an interesting structure that you can walk through multiple times. And this could be a useful structure for all kinds of data presentations that you might be doing, where you walk through different possible courses of action, perhaps, or different recommendations, or different arguments, where you say, well, we're trying to answer this question, we're trying to solve this problem. Here's one way, and here's the pros and cons. Here's another one. Here's the pros and cons. Here's the third one, and pros and cons. And then you can wrap that up and have like an overall conclusion and maybe a recommendation at the end. So this kind of structure is quite useful and quite generalizable, I think, in how it can be applied to presentations and to arguments. So what argument structure does, and what it's for, is it provides a structure, as I just said, for presentations. And this is, of course, meant to be for data-centric presentations. It's a better fit for data, in my humble opinion, than the inverted pyramid, because the inverted pyramid is so much about, here is the thing, the one thing you need to know. But if you have a structure where you kind of tease the outcome a bit, or where you ask a question at the beginning, you end up with a more compelling structure for the whole thing. And it just makes a better presentation than laying it all out from the very beginning. That doesn't mean you should have secrets in your presentation, but you should have just don't lay all your cards on the table, I guess. So as I just said, you create expectations, and with that interest, and as I said earlier, that also helps get people's attention and memory. And I believe that this idea of this pattern is actually quite generalizable. It works quite well across a number of different types of stories and different types of data and situations that you might want to use it in. So, tell better stories. What I'm trying to argue for here is to say that we need to think in terms of how we lay out an argument. And to do that, we need to think in terms that are different from analysis. That includes a few things. One of them certainly is to go from the known to the unknown and to step through those, and to think about structure and to create some tension in your argument, and to not just kind of lay it in front of people and have them try to figure it out themselves. There's a little aside here. There's been some work recently on what's called the curse of knowledge, where you as the presenter know what's in the data, but your audience doesn't. And so by showing them the same charts that you've used, it's just not going to work because you know what to look for, but the audience doesn't. So you need to walk them through, and you need to actually show them the things that you found, and that they need to be able to spot themselves and see themselves. And so, as I said, the tension here is created by raising expectations at the beginning, having a sort of idea of what's going to come. That means that people pay attention because they now have a reason to do so, and it gets their curiosity, and you can appeal to the memory. And because I talked about Hans Rosling at the beginning, it's really useful to look at his presentations, and he has a number of videos on the TED website, and I guess on YouTube as well. He passed away earlier this year, unfortunately, but his work certainly has inspired a lot of people, and has for a good number of years now. And it's always inspiring to me to just look at his work and use that to say, well, how can I do this better? What other ways are there to improve this kind of presentation? And even if you just take one or two little pieces from his work, I think you're going to improve your presentations quite a bit, and it's going to be much more compelling than doing the usual kind of presentation that a lot of people do. And I want to end here on something that people always ask me about. Well, where can I read more about this? And so here is something that I hope is useful. There are two books that I recommend. One is by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. It's called Storytelling with Data, straightforwardly enough, and it's about how to present data. And she has a lot of interesting things to say about how to simplify your data, how to simplify your presentation in the sense of your charts. So she likes to take these fairly common types of things people build and then say, well, actually, there's way too much here. You need to reduce it to just make your main point here. And I think she has a lot of good points there. Because you want to have, as I just said, was the curse of knowledge, you want to have the thing that you want to really talk about, you want to really point out, you want that to stand out, and not just expect your audience to just get what you already know about the data. And she also talks about structure, so she talks a bit about classic kind of storytelling and how to apply some of that to presentations and to talks. And then the other one is Better Presentations by Jonathan Schwabish, and it also has a very straightforward title here. It teaches you how to do better presentations. And his book is also focused on people who show data. So he calls this a guide for scholars, researchers, and wonks. And he's coming from the economist side, and so he's been presenting data for a while. And so he talks about somewhat similar things, but he has a lot more somewhat similar things to Cole, but his focus is more on slide design and picking your charts and things like that. And he also has some interesting points about the structure of the presentation. So both of these books have very interesting bits in them about how to structure your presentation, how to improve the individual charts you use, and also have lots of good examples and good inspiration for doing that. So I think that these together with the Hans Rosling videos are a good combination of material to look at and to get inspired by and to learn from. And so with that, I believe you have some questions, and I'm happy to answer as many of those as I can. And so I'll hand it back to Bill.
Well, Robert, thanks for that excellent presentation. We'll get started with today's Q&A session, and I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a lot of questions that have come in during the presentation, so we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. And during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Robert if you'd like to contact him following today's webinar. So let's get started. Robert, boy, the Hans Rosling video is really great. He puts on a great show. I love the big spear pointer. Are there limits to how theatrical a presenter or a presentation should be?
Yes, for sure. So this is a question I get sometimes, that people are, some people, like I really find Rosling really inspiring and just really awesome to watch. Some people are just really put off by him and say, well, no, this is not what you should be doing. You should be much more serious and show the numbers and things like that. It really depends on your audience. So when you're looking, and you have to know your audience a bit. That's true for all kinds of presentation. If you know that your audience wants to see the table of numbers, and they're gonna peer over that and compare individual decimal point places, then you're gonna give them the numbers. But if you're trying to make a point where your argument is based on the data, but the data itself isn't the main thing you want to talk about or that you need to talk about, then you can get more creative, and then you can make things more fun and more interesting. And of course, again, this depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking in front of a large audience, if you're talking to especially people who aren't familiar with what you're doing, then doing a bit more theatrics perhaps is more interesting and maybe more called for. It also depends on your personality. You have to be careful. if that's your kind of thing, then you can do that. But if you're so it's always a matter of knowing what might be the right way of doing things, and maybe just taking little pieces. So I don't think most of us are really the kind of personality and have quite the enthusiasm and maybe even the materials to go all out on like the Hans Rosling style thing. But it can be helpful. You could make things more impressive by just having something where, I don't know, maybe you bring some Lego figurines or something to represent people, or just having something very simple can be quite compelling and can be quite impressive, and people will remember that, and they will then appreciate your presentation more than if you just do the same PowerPoint thing that everybody else does. And really, my main point here is more about variety a bit. So make things more interesting by thinking about how to do things differently, and don't just go with your standard, PowerPoint template and stuff like that. But think more and more in a more kind of excited way about presentation. So that's my somewhat long-winded answer here.
Okay. Hey, thank you for that terrific answer. And I think the central core of that was know your audience. If they they want numbers, give them numbers. If they're not familiar with all of that and don't need that, then I hear you saying then we can experiment a little bit. Mm-hmm. The audience is I don't want to say confused, but there are two different concepts I think that you've introduced in your talk. One of them is what I would call the story arc. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but CFO is kind of a story arc, right? Claim, question, fact, evidence, conclusion, explanation. That's a story arc. But then you also talked about structure, expectation, tension, curiosity, and that sort of thing. How do you marry those? How do we tell what structures to use in our story arc?
Okay, that's a good question. So, so the idea is really, it's true that these are two things that are not entirely melded together quite yet. But the idea is that the structure, the CFO structure, is one way that I found I didn't make this clear enough, I guess, but this is something that I found by looking at lots of news graphics, news stories, and so that's where it comes from. That's kind of an empirical finding. But what that does, though, is it gives you a structure that has at least slightly more tension than the classic inverted pyramid. So the inverted pyramid doesn't create any kind of tension. It just tells you right away what the main thing is. And but the CFO structure does a bit more of that, because it makes this claim and it doesn't immediately say this is what it is, but it says here's what I'm going to show you. This is going to be what I will try to prove to you. And then, so that's one element of that. But of course, you can always. I'm not saying that you have to follow that to the letter, but it's a helpful way of thinking about how to structure it. Oh, it's a bit like the global warming story too. So global warming story basically misleads you a little bit, because it says this is the question, and we're going to show you possible explanations, and then they basically show you things that aren't even it. So they show you the natural causes themselves, and those individually aren't explaining it. So they're kind of misleading you in a way. But that way you're like, okay, but what is it? What is it? And so you keep wondering what it is. And so then at the end, they kind of reveal that by saying, well, the last thing that we show you is the actual explanation. And then when you combine it all together, or the thing that has the most impact, which is greenhouse gases. And then when you combine it all together, you have essentially the exact shape of that curve. So you create tension here by having this structure that follows this kind of CFO pattern, at least in one variation of it. And so it is a story arc, but it's not the classic kind of story that you would talk about when you think about like Greek drama or fairy tales and so on, where the structure tends to be a bit different. But this is kind of trying to extract elements of story that I think are useful in this context of data, and where I can also argue why they're helpful, like especially with attention and memory, because you want people, of course, to pay attention to what you're talking about and to remember what you told them.
Right. Well, thank you. And you know, our audience is asking, actually, if you would please review the CFO concept again. Maybe you could find that slide and just briefly run through what the elements are in CFO again.
Yes, I can do that. So this starts by saying there is the claim or the question, so that's the C, and then F is facts or evidence, so facts, and then O is conclusion. So the letters here are a bit unfortunate, but it's because I had to pick letters that wouldn't be confusing with the EIP structure that Neil Cohn has. And then the X I didn't show, but there are examples that are more complicated, have explanation steps, so that's where I use the X as well. And then the example, perhaps I'll just walk through that real quick. So this is the CFO, meaning claim or question, then you repeat the facts, or you have facts, and you probably have more than one, and then you end with the conclusion. And the example that I had was the TenYear Pipeline story started with a claim, then had a number of facts, and with the male and female tenured professors, and the male untenured, and then the last step here was this combined fact plus conclusion, which was the untenured faculty, the untenured women.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you for that review. Let me move us back here so the folks can see your contact information. Mm-hmm. Structure is, I don't want to make light of this, but it's a little bit like frosting on the cake. We're trying to find some element of our story that will make our presentation to sparkle. Hope I'm not getting too far out of line here. And part of that, I guess, is human interest. So if my story is really about data and it's not about something as visceral as hunger and people, how do I find human interest, for example, hooks for my data presentation?
Yeah, that's an issue when, of course, my example here was cheating a little bit, because when I'm talking about hunger, I'm talking about people, and so it's very obvious what the human interest is. But I think what you want to look for is, how does what you do impact people? So when you look at a lot of what marketing does is talk about how a product impacts how people do things. You know, how do you market the iPhone, or how do you market products in general? It's by showing how people get something out of it. It's not about, oh, this thing has this cool new feature. I mean, that can be a thing, but often you want to basically show people this helps somebody do something. It makes communication easier. It connects people. All these kind of things. So it can be hard to find sometimes. I talked to somebody recently who was working in commercial real estate. So it's not that obvious how you impact people there, but you can think about how the companies that they work with, how they and the people that work in those companies, how they work and what they do, and how they enjoy their spaces, or hopefully that's what they do, and how their work, that the work of those commercial real estate folks, impacts how these employees are how they perceive their workplace, and how they work, how perhaps hopefully their work is better that way. So you can think about how what you're doing and what your data represents, what that means for somebody, whether that's the people working with you, whether that's your customers, whether that's somebody else, and how hopefully improved by making better decisions and by doing better work for them. And I know that this is not always obvious, it's not always easy, but it helps to do that, because then you have a hook and you have a better connection to what the numbers really represent, rather than just talking about numbers. because we can easily just talk about numbers as numbers and be removed from what they even mean, what they really represent, because we just look at numbers that we're used to. But having that step back to say, well, they actually mean something, they represent something, and those are people and things perhaps and lives, and just realizing that and making that a point and making that a bit of a focus. It doesn't have to be like your main thing, but at least having that as maybe not a focus, but a perspective can be helpful to make your story more compelling and more relatable, especially, again, depending on your audience. If you talk to people who aren't as familiar with your field, who might not even get what you're even talking about, then connecting that to people is going to be much more effective, much more compelling, and they're going to understand much more easily why you care about these numbers and why they should care about those numbers than if you just talk about your data as data.
Robert, thank you for that great answer. Now, one of the really interesting things about this presentation is that you really made us focus on planning about how to present as opposed to just the raw presentation. We pick a story arc, we find some structure elements to go with it, but then when we get down to putting the visuals on paper or whatever we're using, for example, in the hidden hunger story, there were a lot of images. Should we be biased toward using images and other media, even though it's a pretty straightforward business presentation?
Yeah, I guess this all comes back to this question of who's your audience, who are you talking to, and what do you want them to take away. In a presentation to your immediate group of peers, you're not going to do that probably because they know what you're talking about, and it's not as important to do this. But when you're talking to somebody who isn't as familiar with what you're doing, or when you just want to make a point that's a bit more, that stands out, that's more memorable than individual charts, then having something in there that's an image and that's unusual, or a video or something like that, can be quite effective. And it really depends on what it is that you're doing and what your data looks like and what the data is about. But it can be quite effective, and especially when it's unexpected, when you're usually just presenting data and now suddenly you have an image that really stands out and can make things much more interesting that way.
Okay, and when we're talking about making things stand out, the audience has suggested, well, I guess as you did in your presentation to us, some very personalized stories are very powerful. Such and such happened to Joe, or such and such happened to this group of people. But I would imagine that there is a point at which too many personalized stories begins to outweigh the facts. You want to expand on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a matter of finding the right balance there. So I think usually you want to make sure that the stories you tell are useful to your, that they are useful to your point, your presentation, that they really support your point, and that you're not trying to make the same point using several different stories. It's just going to wear out your audience. They're just not going to want to hear all of those. So you want to be careful to just talk about make some strong points with a story, but not overplay that. Yeah, for sure. And find the right balance to just use those to just really accentuate the main points, but not go over the top.
Right, balance and know your audience, always the key issues. As a last question, one of the things you didn't talk about in this presentation are tools. Are there particular tools that will help you with structuring a presentation that you'd like to tell us about?
So I think that's actually one of the things I think is important to realize, that the tools really aren't that important. So people are always down on like PowerPoint and all these things. I think it's really important to realize that the tools can help you, but they shouldn't limit you. So John Travis talks a lot about how to use Post-its and paper and pencils to structure your presentation. I think that's a good way of doing things, is to step away from the tool and think more in terms of what's your overall structure, rather than being too tied to the particular tool that you're using.
Well, Robert, thank you. Those were some great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Robert and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendars for November 28th. That's our next Data Science Central webinar, which will be Deep Learning from Basic Principles through Training Models, and that'll be sponsored by IBM Watson. Also remember that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. A special thanks to Tableau for their sponsorship, as well as to our speaker today, Robert Kosara, for his insight into today's topic. Well, this is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on November 28th. Have a great day.